Welcome to meeting number 90 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of the members. I'll make it very simple. Just make sure that we do not put our earpieces near the microphones. Make sure that your microphones are off if you're not speaking. And for the same things, make sure that you're on Zoom. Make sure your booms are down if you're speaking. And please raise your hand on the raise hand function if you'd like to be, if you have any comments or things of that sort. Any other reminders, just if there's any comments, just bring them through the chairs. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, just raise your hand function as well. Pursuant to the order of reference from the House dated Thursday, November 9th, 2023, and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, November 20th, 2023, we are meeting to study the subject matter of Supplementary Estimates B 2023-24 with votes 1B and 5B under the Department for Women and Gender Equality. I would like to welcome Minister Ian, who is accompanied by officials from the Department of Women and Gender Equality. Minister Ian, it is wonderful to have you here today. We are going to be granting you 5 minutes for your opening comments. And the clock starts now. You've got the floor.
Hello, bonjour, Madam Chair and honorable members. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais souligner que nous sommes sur le territoire.
Before we start, I would like to say that we are on the non-ceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm happy to be here today to discuss the Supplementary Budget B of my department.
To be part of this department's work and see up close the positive change that comes from the programs that we offer and that we support. I see it when I speak to people that put their heart into helping women and children flee violent situations. I see it when I speak to organizations that are connecting women to economic opportunities and people that are breaking down systemic barriers, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, members of 2S LGBTQI+ communities, newcomers, and Black and racialized women. Wages' role is so key at a time when people, specifically marginalized people, are feeling the strain of inflation and trying to make ends meet. These programs make sure that no one is left behind in these really tough times and make sure that women are connected to well-paying jobs and have more money in their pocket. In our role as convener, knowledge broker, and capacity builder, we act as the glue between government departments, grassroots organizations, and we work alongside provincial and territorial governments to deliver on our commitment to build a more equitable country. You've all seen this work through the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence that we launched just last year, and we've already reached bilateral agreements with Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Prince Edward Island, Nunavut, Yukon, Alberta, Northwest Territories, and an agreement for the province of Quebec to support its strategy. The funding from these agreements is already flowing to provinces and territories and is reaching frontline services to prevent violence and address the root causes of this issue, which we know needs to include men and boys. This is on top of the $55 million in direct federal funding to Indigenous organizations to end gender-based violence. On the economic front, we've been able to support women's organizations who play a key role in improving access to education, employment, health, and social services. Earlier this fall, I had the pleasure of announcing support for the LEAP PICO Center for Social Impact. It's an organization that helps not-for-profit organizations tap into private sector talent. And these nonprofits rather, do so much, and they have so little. They connect women to well-paying jobs. They find women and children affordable housing and social supports and help newcomers find their footing. Through partnerships, they've already unlocked $21 million in pro bono work from private corporations and positively impacted 6.4 million Canadian lives. And in the face of rising transphobia and homophobia in Canada and around the world, we launched the federal 2S LGBTQI+ Action Plan, supporting grassroots organizations that are focused on building safer communities. While progress has been made, the gains we've achieved have not been enjoyed equally, and the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath has threatened to roll back decades of progress on gender equality. Nous savons que nous devons aller plus loin.
We know that we must do more and faster.
No one is falling through the cracks in their time of need, and we're doing this through these supplementary estimates by requesting $6.9 million to help organizations on the front lines like LEAP, and $18.6 million going towards the Menstrual Equity Fund pilot that is making sure no one in this country has to choose between buying menstrual products or putting food on the table. Je suis convaincue qu'on travaille.
I am convinced that by working together, Canada will still be the best place in the world to live.
Firsthand that we all benefit when we have equal opportunities to succeed. Merci, Madam Chair. To questions.
Thank you very much. Today, joining Minister Ian, we have Frances McRae, a Deputy Minister, as well as Aaliyah Butt, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic Policy. We will we will have the Minister for the first hour from 11 till 12, and then from 12 till 1 p.m. we will continue with the department. We will begin with our first round of questions, and I'm going to pass it over to Dominique Vienne. Dominique, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Bonjour et bienvenue, Madame la Ministre. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Thank you for being with us today. Can you give us some information on the Menstrual Equity Fund that you implemented? A fund of $25 million on over 2 years. And this fund was created for 2022, 2023, 2023, 2024. This morning you are asking for additional funding beyond the $25 million requested for the proper operation of that fund, correct?
So right now, Dominique, and thank you for the question, it is actually $18 million in estimates, 18.9 million, am I correct, Deputy? Yes, in estimates, not 25. And I'm so glad that you asked about that question. I got a text just a little while ago, and I saw a product that actually arrived at a food bank. So National Food Bank Canada is the umbrella that is rolling this out. The products are starting to roll out across the country. And I have to quickly tell you, the food bank in my own riding of Toronto Centre, there was a woman, when I made this announcement initially on the 18.9 million, who had a pad. She cut it in 3.
Madame la Ministre,
Yes.
si vous voulez, on y revient.
Madam Minister, perhaps we can come back to that afterwards. But if I understood correctly, so of that $25 million, well, the program is costing less, or have we misunderstood?
Costing less. It's a pilot, and when it actually rolled out, Dominique. So right now, in the Sub B, it's 18.9 million, not the 25. Is that making sense to you?
Oui.
Okay.
Qu'est-ce que vous...
Yes, and what have you spent up till now?
And so right now, and I can get you that number, and the deputy is working on that. We wanted to make sure that this was a national program, and it is hitting every province, including the province of Quebec. I believe NDG, Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, they looked at communities that needed this most. Product will be arriving. It's already arriving and will continue to arrive so that those who need product can get it. And so this is continuing. As I said, it's a pilot, so we have to document, we have to measure, we have to see whether or not this works across the country. From Nunavut to Quebec, does it work? Is it working? Who's partaking? Is this umbrella formula that we have actually the way we need to go? And as you know, with a pilot, if it's working, then we can request more. But right now, and this is what's been tabled in Subs B, it's 18.9 million, and that's rolling out now. As to how much we have spent so far, Deputy, to you.
S'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. For the amount spent, that's $17.9 million for the agreement that we signed, as discussed the Minister, or as mentioned the Minister rather, with recipients. We also have in our documents $0.6 million for internal operations of the department, and that's part of the total. That's $0.6 million. So $100,000 is for departmental operations to do what exactly? answer. I can explain what we've done since the budget of 2022, which announced the program. This is something that we didn't have a lot of experience in our department when it was announced in April. And so we took some time with Minister Suds, who had been in the role as parliamentary secretary, to do consultations. We wanted to be sure that the pilot project was going to work. We also had a competitive process that you're likely aware of in order to find an appropriate recipient. Did you have to hire contractors, or was the 600,000 used by, or rather to pay for officials for the department? Microphone, please. You have 1 minute. Briefly, the pilot project goes until March 2024, correct? Yes. And the food banks were determined to be recipients in September? Is that the case? That's not a lot of time given to them to do the work.
Given to them to do the work. But as the deputy pointed out, we wanted to make sure that we engaged with communities that needed it most. And then, of course, it's a pilot. So if this works, because you know policy comes from things that are measured, if this works and we get the numbers that we need and we see where the need is, then we can go back and we can readdress this.
Je veux juste peut-être renchérir juste un petit point.
I just want to add, if you go to the Food Banks of Canada website, they have a great summary. We chose food banks because they were ready.
Very much. We're now going to pass the floor over to Sonia Sidhu. Sonia, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, all the officials, to being with us and the hard work you are doing on the ground to lift women and girls. This committee, Minister, just started a study on women's economic empowerment. We are looking forward to hearing from witnesses to hear about the challenges women face while in the workforce or starting business, as well as the success stories of women when they're breaking barriers in various fields that are male-dominated. As the Minister of Women and Gender Equality, what step are you taking to close the gender wage gap, and what are you doing to support women-owned enterprise or businesses?
Thank you so much for the question, Sonia. And we as a federal government have addressed that gap. It's the private sector that has not. And we see what happens to women when they do the same job as a man and don't get paid the same amount. And so that is the basis for a lot of what we do here at Women and Gender Equality, also working in concert with the Minister of Small Business. There are programs, entrepreneurship programs. This has been something that has been a bedrock where I have seen firsthand lives changed. And it isn't just women helping women. I mentioned the PICO Center for Social Impact. It's engaging the private sector to help women with mentorship, to get them started, to make sure they know what to do when they get to a bank and have to ask for a loan. I also want to point out Indigenous women here and the $55 million capacity fund that we have that supports Indigenous women who lead businesses, and point out that that sector in particular, Sonia, is doing so very well. Indigenous women are leading when it comes to entrepreneurship in this country. And it is funding, like the funding that we provide at Wage, that helps with that.
Thank you, Minister. Yesterday, we stood together to commemorate a dark chapter in Canadian history. It has been over 30 years since the murder of 14 young women at Polytechnic, Montreal. This act of violence, misogyny, shook our country and led Parliament to designate December 6th as the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Yesterday, we commemorated the day. Minister, you were there, remembering this horrifying act of misogyny. We have committed $500 million in the last budget for the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. Can you update the committee on the progress of the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence?
Thank you so much for the question, Sonia. And if I might, I just want to mention Antiane LaRouche here, as well as Dominique, who spoke in the chamber yesterday, as did I, on the Day of Remembrance. And such powerful words. But Antiane, you in particular said, we're here every year. We're here every year doing this. What does this mean? How much work is getting done? And those are valid questions. And as I looked at all of us standing in that house, all of us women standing in that house, I thought we need to really understand that this is not a women's issue. And that men and boys need to and have to be involved in this equation, or as Antiane said, we are going to keep coming back and coming back and coming back. I was so pleased to have that moment of silence. Many of you engaged, and we were there at the flame, but it really just speaks so loudly as to why the endorsement of this 10-year National Action Plan is so important. You asked for an update, and so far, with the help of Lisa, our parliamentary secretary, we have signed into agreement 10 provinces and territories, along with the federal government so far. That means money has rolled out. That means grassroots organizations are actually being impacted and can help people on the ground. 10 provinces and territories. It also speaks to the teamwork that this is going to take. This means provinces, territories, the federal government, municipalities, all on board with regards to fighting this and ending this. And again, can I stress, men and boys, there's no way we solve this if we don't address that. And that is about prevention, and that is the first pillar of our action plan. It's prevention. When provinces and territories come up with their plans, 25%, at least 25%, have to include prevention. Then it's underserved communities, and then it's making sure that the sector itself is secure. Those are the three tenets, and all provinces and territories need to meet them when they bring their plans. 10 of them so far are in agreement. Thank you, Sonia.
My next
15 seconds.
I just want to see that yesterday I came across a UNICEF report showing 20% reduction of child poverty in Canada from 2014 to 2021. This is a remarkable achievement. What policies do you attribute this to, and what more you can say on that?
In one word, CCB.
Thank you. Okay, we're now going to move it over to Adrienne LaRoche for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair. Others have already mentioned it, and I'll come back to it later, but on December 6th, every year, we remember that femicide that happened in 1989, where 14 women were killed for being women. I talked about this at length yesterday, but I will come back to it again during my questions. We need to remember them, and we cannot forget, even if it's 30 years later. I was 7 years old, and that's one of the first things that I remember seeing as a girl. I remember seeing those images on TV. I have a daughter, and she's 21 months old, and it truly changes the way I see that event. And I've been thinking about her a lot, and I've been speaking for 2 years now with this child in mind. Misogyny is such a problem. and we haven't moved forward that much. There has been some improvement, but femicides have been increasing, and it's extremely concerning. But I'll come back to that later in my questions. Another thing that I find concerning, yesterday I mentioned acting, and to do that we need more representative and diverse parliaments. I went to Rwanda last year to see how we could have more women in government, because we need them. Women represent 50% of the population, and only 30% of MPs are women. But with what's going on now, I don't know how we'll be able to bring more women into politics. For my colleagues who are going to spend the next 36 hours voting, we'll be doing some relay. It's going to be intense. And how do we try to bring more women in when we're spending nights, entire nights, voting in this extremely partisan environment? We need to do politics differently in 2023. And it's not in doing politics this way that we're going to attract more women. I apologize, I had to say it as a mother. I find that it is a poor reflection of our democracy. This weekend, I spent time in my riding, and I'm not sure what's going to happen in the coming hours, and I think I'm not the only one who has these thoughts about the situation. That said, Madam Minister, we have $6.3 million in the supplementary estimates for 2023-24, and that's part of the $160 million for women's groups and equity-seeking groups that are seeking funds. The goal of the program is to have full participation of women in the democratic process and to bring about systemic change. How can that funding help women's groups for equity? What can that bring as change?
Adrienne, merci beaucoup.
Thank you for your question.
I just want to acknowledge your courage and acknowledge the leader that you are, because I can't bypass everything that you just said. And I want to acknowledge that. And how do we get more women in politics is a big question when we are in the environment that you described. And I think more women seeing people like you doing this, and not just doing it, but calling out the things that you see, is really important. This is why, we have some members that we're looking at on a screen right now. This is why that is important. This is why that is important. And this is why we voted to keep it. But it is hard, and you are honest in everything that you say. So thank you for saying it, and thank you for making sure that it's on the record. So I had to address that before the women's program.
You're right. 1 minute, Adrienne, 1 minute.
Mais j'aimerais revenir concrètement à ces argents.
I would like to come back to the funds. What organizations will be able to apply? And I would like to come back to the budget and that program more specifically.
So I thought I just had to make sure that it was the women's program that you were talking about. The women's program is so very important, and I want to address here what has been categorized and characterized as cuts to it, and they aren't. It's emergency funding, and emergency funding, Adrienne, is emergency funding, meaning the National Action Plan and the $500 million behind it that I mentioned before is meant to pick up where that emergency funding left off. So the fact that people are saying, this is a cut, why did you cut? I will always say emergency funding isn't sustainable. And the National Action Plan that I laid out and have been laying out this morning picks up where that left off.
Thank you very much, Ministry. And I'm just going to remind everybody of my wacky arm, so when you start seeing me going like this, that means wind it down. Okay, I'm now going to pass the floor over to Benita. Benita, you have the floor for the next 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today. And I do want to talk a little bit about the $150 million cut to the women's shelters, but I wanted to start with the menstrual equity.
Yes.
I recently received a number of letters from a classroom of social justice students from Charles Best School, which is on the unceded and traditional territory of the Kwekwetlum. And Minister, in these letters, they were asking for mandatory menstrual education. And I just want to read to you part of the email from the teacher, the social justice teacher, Ms. Leslie. We are advocating for the inclusion of mandatory menstruation education in the public school system to dispel misinformation, empower children with knowledge, and help end gender stereotypes. I believe you will find the students' arguments compelling, and we look forward to hearing from you in the near future. So I am going to share those letters with you, Minister, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing to the students, who I will definitely share this information with, what kind of education is planned. I know we heard in this committee in testimony around the menstrual equity study that we did that more education is needed. So what can I tell the students about that?
First of all, I love that students are writing to you and that they are so passionate. But as you know, and they know that provinces have jurisdiction over education. Do I wish I did? Do I wish I did, Benita? I do. But it is provinces that do. But here's what you can share with them. The fact that we even have a pilot, and it's called the Menstrual Equity Fund, is educating people. When it was included in the budget last year, it was considered a small thing, but there was so much interest in it. People wanted to know more. That's educating people. What does this mean? What does it mean that to buy menstrual products in Nunavut is $60 for like a box of pads? What is that? What do you mean? What do you mean that, women are showing up at food banks and other places and there's nothing there for them? But there is now. What does that mean? So provinces handle education, as you know. I am also the Minister of Youth, as you know. And so I love that they are engaged and they are passionate. But I would encourage, as the deputy pointed out, the National Food Bank of Canada has an amazing website that is up now, and it will show students, because I know they are interested in these things, graphs and figures as to who gets what across this country, how it's being rolled out, how much money is behind all of this. It lays it all out, and it's a great teaching tool. I used to be a supply teacher, so I'm just letting you know. It's a great teaching tool.
Great.
So, but I love that they reached out.
Thank you so much. And as I said, I'll send those letters on to you.
Please do.
So I wanted to talk about the $150 million cut to women's shelters under the WAGE program. And I hear you now that you've just said about the women's program, that these are emergency funds. But, gender-based violence is not an emergency. It's systemic, embedded, consistent. So my question is that shelters have an ongoing need for operational funding to combat gender-based violence, because in addition, it's on the rise. So the current women's program is not helping shelters. What is the government going to do to offer long-standing protection of women through shelters?
And we are. And so the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence is a replenishment of funds. It's a continuation of our work. And when you talk about that cut, I say, listen, emergency funding is emergency funding, and that was in the context of the pandemic, Benita. So during the pandemic, which was qualified and is an emergency, we stepped up and said, immediately $300 million is going out to make sure that shelters have exactly what they need in this situation. The action plan, with the $500 million behind it, picks up on this. And I can tell you, because shelter organizations are benefiting, as 10 provinces, and we've made these announcements, they are benefiting, including in my province of Ontario. And I was meant to be in your province today, but because of said votes that Adrienne so eloquently talked about, I will not be traveling. But I was meant to sign into, well, we signed the agreement, but to announce tomorrow morning in BC because your province has signed on the rollout of this part of the action plan for the province of British Columbia. Shelters are benefiting. Organizations on the ground are benefiting. And the good thing about each province and territory is that they can map out exactly what they need. So the province of BC will target what it sees and needs and will put that forward and has put that forward in its plan. I look forward to getting there sooner rather than later.
Anita, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Minister. And as you're talking about the communities and as they need it, I want to talk a little bit about the fall economic statement and the failure of the government to mention the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals. Today I am subbing in for my colleague from Winnipeg Centre, and this is a crisis in her riding, and I wonder if you could just share what's being done to support murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit individuals across the country.
Minister Ian, we are already over time on that. Benita, if you don't mind, I'm going to put that to your second round.
Perfect.
Okay? Thank
But
you very
please
much.
ask it.
We're now going to move over to our second round with 5 minutes for the Liberal and NDP and 2.5 for the Bloc and you know what I mean, CPC and Liberal. Please work with me today. And 2.5 minutes for the NDP and Bloc. Michelle Freire, we'll start with you for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you to the Minister for being here today. And some serious issues happening in our country. You know, you said on record in your statements today, Minister, that policy comes from things that are measured. Those were your words. And in the past year, more than 50 cities and municipalities across Ontario have declared intimate partner violence and gender-based violence to be an epidemic, including Toronto, Sudbury, Hamilton, Kingston, and my hometown of Peterborough. One woman is killed every other day in Canada inside the terrifying rates of violence. And under this Prime Minister, violence against women has increased 79%. So my question to you today, Minister, is we are studying S205 in this committee. And the intention of Bill S205 is to better protect individuals who file domestic violence complaints. As well, it creates a peace bond in the criminal code that is specific to and provides for more severe conditions for individuals accused of domestic violence. And the bill would allow the judge to require the accused to wear an electronic monitoring device if the judge determines that the victim's safety and life are at risk during the interim release period. Pretty important legislation that was brought forth by a senator whose own daughter was murdered. But under this committee, the Liberals and NDP voted to remove the two major components of that bill, one being victim consultation and the word intimate partner. And they voted to remove intimate partner and replace it with persons. You've said here that we have an epidemic. You say we have an issue with gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. How can you justify your party removing this in this bill?
Michelle, it's good to see you. And first and foremost, our government, and under Minister Virani, has declared intimate partner violence an epidemic. My home province of Ontario, under the leadership of Premier Doug Ford, has not. So I will start there. With response on S205, it's my understanding, Michelle, that it's being studied by committee, that clause by clause, as I understand it, is still in progress. And as a guest of this committee, I will not speak to the decisions of committee members and the decisions that they're making here. However, I will say, with regards to intimate partner violence, just this year, Kira's Law was passed.
Point, Minister, and thank you. I think it's absolutely your responsibility to speak to this. This is your ministry file. You are there for women. And to Kira's Law, we worked on that in this committee. It is critical. We actually had testimony from Kira's stepfather, who said how important this legislation is and to leave it the way it is. It is your party, Minister, that has removed these two components of this bill. And how in the world can you justify not having every safeguard possible when these cities have declared epidemics? One woman killed every other day in Canada inside the terrifying rates of violence.
Which is why my province of Ontario should know
Why are
that
you
it is
passing
an-
that to the province, Minister?
I am making
you are
it
the
clear.
federal minister.
I absolutely am, and proud to be, Michelle, but I'm not a member of this committee. I am the federal minister, you're absolutely right, but this is still being studied by committee.
So they've already
it's
removed
clause
those
by-
amendments.
Point of
Clause by
order, Madam
clause is
Chair.
still in progress.
Yes, Sonia?
I just want to remind the member, please allow the witness to answer the question.
I appreciate that. As I've always done, is the majority of the time will go to the questioner, that is the time, but there will always be time given to the minister as well. So thank you very much, Sonia. Go ahead.
Thank you, Minister. I think I go back to the words you said. Policy comes from things that are measured. How much more measurement do you need of violence against women that it's increased 79% under this Prime Minister to implement change and to not remove amendments in a bill that protects the victim, that consults the victim, that removes the word intimate partner with persons? How can you justify that?
30 seconds to respond.
S205 is still being studied, Michelle, and I look forward to what comes out of this committee. Thank you so much.
The bill is being studied, but your party removed these words, and that is done. That has been done in this committee.
And I am not part of this committee, Michelle.
Thank you very much. We'll now move over for the next 5 minutes, and I'm going to pass it online to Anita Vanderbilt. Anita, you're online. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Minister, let me start by just saying that I appreciate very much that you are giving the agency to the members of this committee to make our own decisions and our own choices when it comes to legislation. I think it is very important that the legislative branch be able to make those decisions. So thank you very much for making sure that we're able to do that. But the question I wanted to ask you is to go into a little bit more detail about the question earlier about the wage gap. I was in the 42nd Parliament, the chair of the Pay Equity Special Committee. And out of that, as you know, we had for the first time, after 40 years of feminist groups trying, we finally have pay equity legislation at the federal level. But pay equity itself is not the whole story on the wage gap. Obviously, women's caregiving responsibilities, the fact that women-owned businesses aren't able to scale up as quickly on entrepreneurship. When women do face violence, they often also face economic abuse. There are many, many things that create barriers that contribute to that wage gap. I wonder if you could address what we're doing broadly on the gender wage gap.
Thank you so much for the question, Anita, and giving me the opportunity to expound a little bit more on what we're doing and have been doing. I want to start by saying, because I had mentioned Indigenous women before, and in my estimation, it's a story that isn't told enough, how that wage gap, how opportunities for Indigenous women are turning into and have been amazing success stories of businesses across this country and businesses that are recognized globally. And 31% of wage funding goes to Indigenous people. And I point out that stat because that speaks to empowering women, empowering communities. And we know that when women do well, communities do well. There are so many stories, Anita, of women being afraid to go to financial institutions, knowing that they won't be heard, or hearing stories that they were turned down for loans, that they weren't supported, that they didn't have the mentorship they needed, that they had a dream that they didn't think that they could actually pursue because they wouldn't have the benefits that, frankly, men would have. And on top of that, as you mentioned, children. And we know in this country that women, by and large, are caregivers. When it comes to that, and this is where we weave everything together, having childcare and $10 a day childcare in our country that is being rolled out, in my home province of Ontario, per child, $8,500 is being saved, allows women to stay in the workforce. It allows them to learn. It allows them to progress. So there is that. I also believe as the federal government, we are a model. And because we've passed this legislation that you mentioned, Anita, this is a model to the private sector. It's a model to others that shows what can happen when women are rightly paid the way that their male counterparts are and rightly given the opportunities that they deserve.
And Minister, thank you so much for talking about the intersectionalities, the fact that different groups of women, of course, face that barrier even more. And you mentioned Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. What about women with disabilities, racialized women, newcomer women? There's a number of different intersectionalities, and it can be many of these things within one woman. If you could talk a little bit about that too.
Thank you so much. And that's the basis of what we do. In all of our programming at Wage, we have put those disproportionately impacted, and that means everybody that you've just mentioned and that intersectionality, Anita. So whether it is women with disabilities, women from communities that are rural, racialized women, newcomer women. This is where the mentorship opportunities, and I mentioned PICO Center, but there are others, even within friendship centers across this country. There are opportunities that women now have where they are getting mentorship from those in the private sector, pro bono. There are programs meaning that newcomers are welcome to their communities, but given the skills that they need to get their first job. And might I point out here that this
Minister?
is... Oh.
Sorry, that's all my fault.
Sorry.
We're way over time. I'm
Okay,
sorry,
sorry,
Anita.
I will
sorry,
stop.
Anita. That's my clock error. So I do apologize. I'm now going to pass it over for 2.5 minutes to Adriana Roche. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Minister, we talked about violence against women, and yesterday I met with the Alliance of Francophone Women of Canada, and they told me that they were left out of the National Action Plan, and they said that there were no measures to help Francophone women. In a situation of violence against women, it's important to have services in one's language, in French. There are no shelters for Francophone women, for example. There are no spaces for those women in Canada. Are you going to rectify the situation, Madam Minister? Thank you for the question, Andréane.
Last week to be in Quebec, and we missed you being there, and we will catch up to announce with Minister Biron Quebec's strategy to end gender-based violence. Minister Biron pointed out all of the things that Quebec is doing in order to address this.
Je ne parlais pas de la stratégie au Québec.
I wasn't talking about the strategy in Quebec. I was talking about Francophone women elsewhere in Canada. In Quebec, we have our own department and we speak French, that's fine. But Canada doesn't offer the same services in the action plan to help Francophone women outside of Quebec. And so Francophone women mentioned during a meeting yesterday that there was nothing to help them in the action plan. And they were consulted, Madam Minister. They shared their proposals with you.
They were consulted.
30 seconds.
They were consulted, and they are part of the minority groups that are laid out in the action plan.
Madame la ministre, malgré qu'elle...
Madam Minister, you say that they're part of the minority groups in the action plan, but they don't have any services and any help in French. There's nothing in the action plan to help them specifically. So there are no adapted services for them. That's what they said to me yesterday during a meeting. They told me that I need to ask you the question because they want to have services in their language. Thank you.
We are now going to pass it over to Benita. Benita, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, in July of this year, CBC published a report card on the implementation of the calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous women. It has been 4 years since the National Inquiry published the calls, yet only 2 out of 231 calls have been completed, while more than half haven't even been started. What is WAGE doing to further the implementation of the calls for justice, and why aren't these efforts mentioned in the fall economic statement or being funded?
Thank you so much, Benita, for the question. And as I mentioned, it is, and I wouldn't be going too far to say this, the bedrock of this ministry. 31% of all wage funding goes to Indigenous people, Indigenous-led businesses, Indigenous communities. Under my portfolio, we've invested $55 million over 5 years to bolster the capacity of Indigenous women and to us LGBTQIA plus people and organizations. And this is violence prevention programming. This is grassroots programming. This is program that I've seen. This is young people getting back to the land and learning from elders. This is the revitalization of language. This is starting and being led by Indigenous people, but starting with the youngest people. This is looking at the causes, the root causes of violence. And might I mention the Red Dress Alert, because Leah isn't here today and does such excellent work. And as you mentioned, Winnipeg Center is the epicenter of a lot of this. Leah is now sitting at a table, and she is alongside emergency preparedness. She's alongside Indigenous Crown Services. She's alongside ISK. She's alongside many other ministries in understanding how we roll this out well and make sure that this happens in a way that is Indigenous-led. Leah is sitting at that table now, and I'm glad that she is. And so there is a lot of work being done, Benita. Is it all that needs to be done? Absolutely not. But on wages part, and I will again say it is the bedrock.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Minister. We're now going to just finish up this round. It's 5 minutes to Dominique and 5 minutes on to Emanuela. Dominique, I'll pass the floor over to you. 5 minutes.
Oui, je comprenais que
I will be sharing my time with Michelle. Madam Minister, your colleague, the Minister of the Treasury Board, last April, after the budget was tabled, announced cuts of $15 billion because there was a lot of spending that had been done. Have you heard about cuts to your department directly?
I will send that over to the deputy because I want to be specific. Dominique.
Oui, mais les fonctionnaires seront avec nous tout à l'heure, mais j'aimerais savoir.
Officials will be with us later, so I was a minister in the past. Perhaps I imagine you had discussions with the Treasury Board chair. What discussions did you have on those cuts?
I haven't had discussions on those cuts as yet.
Vous n'avez donc pas eu de commande de...
And so you haven't heard about cuts that you'll have to do?
Monique, the question was, have I had a discussion with the Treasury Board President about cuts? I have not. But as soon as there is more information on that, we can get that to you. I just want to be very, very clear.
Est-ce que votre...
Has your department received an order to make cuts by the Treasury Board?
OK. De quel montant?
What are the amounts?
En tout respect, Madame la Ministre, je suis un peu étonnée que vous...
Madam Minister, I'm shocked that you don't have that number on hand.
I do have it on
Rapidement.
hand. I do.
Je vais expliquer les...
I'll explain quickly the discussions with Treasury Board. The process is ongoing. We will do what we've been asked to do. What did we ask you to do? Those numbers will be shown in the estimates. What you've seen in the supplementary estimates B, it does show a cut in travel and professional services budgets of about $569,000. That's what has appeared in the documents so far. Last question. The colleagues on this side of the room have not understood. Of the total budget of the Menstrual Equity Fund, are we talking about $25 million or $18 million for the program?
18 million now.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just going into the pilot program for menstrual equity, because we're here today for supplementary estimates, and I know you're saying you're asking for 18 million more, but the supplementary estimates that we have here is over 25 million when it's broken down. But I understand the equity contributions are simply 18 million. Just for clarification, is that what when you're coming up with that number? Okay. So one of the questions I have, and when we studied this in committee, is the fact that federally regulated employees are eligible for this. That seems a little odd and wrong when you have such low-income people accessing food banks, highest in history, and you're mandating that federally regulated employees are subsidized to receive menstrual equity products.
So, Michelle, thanks for the question, but those are two different things. So it's just that they happened at the same time. So the Minister of Labor, and I believe it was Minister Haidu for ISK as well, at the same time as this pilot, there were 3 things rolling out, that in all federally regulated buildings under the Ministry of Labor, there had to be menstrual products.
And how much is that costing, Minister?
Well, that is a Minister of Labor decision, so I can get that to you.
Yeah, if you could table that for the committee, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, that's fine. And then our menstrual equity pilot is, and that fund is
so
separate.
Just
so
I
it's
only,
not. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying
Yeah.
that. Just for quickly, because I only have 30 seconds. The Food Banks of Canada program is only paying $106,000 to administer the program, but under your operating grants here, you're saying $537,000. It is the food banks who are really doing this, but they're only spending $106,000. Why is the government using $537,000 of taxpayer dollars to administer this cost?
Okay, we are over time.
If you
so
could
that-
just table that.
If you could
that would
table
be
that.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Saying that. We're going to move
table all of
online to Emanuela. Emanuela, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here with us today. The first question I don't think you'll necessarily be able to answer, but I would also like documents tabled if possible. Women's health is a major concern of mine. There's a huge gap when it comes to women and men being misdiagnosed. Women are misdiagnosed 30% more often than men. And, because for years women were left out of research, there is very little known about many women's conditions such as endometriosis, ovarian cancer, etc. I had done a lot of work trying to push Minister Duclos when he was the Minister of Health to change the guidelines that are put in place for breast cancer so that women across the country could get screened as of age 40 instead of 50. I know that that's not necessarily your, it's more the Minister of Health's job to do that. But is there any way that you can help us get the information to committee to say if there has been a gender-based analysis put on the budget that we put forward last year on health, because there was a big chunk of money going into health, and if we can see how much of that was going towards women, if there was a gender-based analysis done on that, because I think that would be really helpful.
You're absolutely right, and thank you for the question, Emanuela. And I will just say on that breast cancer screening, this is where intersectionality becomes an issue as well. But because for Black women, in particular, the screening ages can be deadly. And so when it comes to the intersectionality of when we screen, whether it's 40, whether it's 50, that is real. So that all of that will be tabled. And yes, as far as GBA plus, it is applied to each and every ministry across government. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And if you can table like any information you have on the money that was put into health last year, that would be great. And I know that you kicked off the 16 days of activism against to end gender-based violence in Quebec. And so I'm wondering if you can go a little bit more into detail about what the province of Quebec is planning on doing to help combat gender-based violence.
Thanks so much. We actually kicked it off with Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and it's been ongoing. But Emmanuel, you're right, Quebec was last week. Minister Biron was talking about those that are impacted most. And so it's important to state, again, that each province and territory has autonomy when it comes to what they feel their province or territory needs. Minister Biron talked a lot about Indigenous communities. She talked a lot about prevention. She talked about men and boys. My colleague, Minister Duclos, who is the MP for Quebec, talked about the importance and what it means for men and boys not only to be at the table, but to understand that they are and can be the root causes of this violence. Minister Biron has a plan that will be continued to be rolled out, but Indigenous people focusing on strengthening the sector as well is a big part of that plan. And if you'd like, Emanuela, we can connect you to Minister Biron and her team as well. We will be putting on our website the framework for this plan. And what that means is a breakdown of each province and territory, how much money has been received, and where they are targeting those funds, so that you can see which province is doing what, who is targeting what their plan is, and whether they are sticking to their goals, because on an annual basis, they will be before our department to look at what they've accomplished, and that is contingent on whether or not the money continues. Thanks so much for the question.
45 seconds.
Okay, thanks. I know that this is going to be a loaded question for 45 seconds. Violence against Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit people, does continue to be the biggest tragedy in this country. And you did speak a little bit about what we've done. I'm wondering if you can, you said 30% of the funding has gone there. Is there a specific number that you can...
Yeah.
31%.
31% of
what does
all
that
wage
equate
funding.
to?
So there's a capacity fund to a lot of things. So there's a capacity fund that is $55 million. And what it's meant to do, Emanuela, is bolster the capacity of 2S LGBTQI plus people and I'm getting the wrap up. It's meant to bolster them as a whole. So it addresses violence, it addresses all of these things, but I'm willing to let's chat more about this because I'm getting the wrap up sign. And we can get all the information to you, okay?
So yes, you're getting the wrap-up sign because your 5 minutes were left, but we do have 1 minute left. Yes. And that's why you're going to be stuck with me for a question, because Emanuela got me thinking big time. I was sitting on the Health Committee last night where we were talking about random tests. I believe the majority of the people that were being used in these random tests on breast cancer, 98%, I believe, was the number for white women. We know that for people that are racialized, that it's greater than the age of 40 should be screening. White women, I believe it's at the age of 60 where they're more prone, so it needs to start earlier. I cannot see that a gender-based analysis was actually done on the 2018 guidelines. Can you please table that if possible? That's my...
Absolutely, and with pleasure.
You. I really appreciate it. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank Minister Ian for coming here. We will be remaining with Ms. Butts and Ms. McRae. We will have them for the remainder of the hour. But on behalf of the committee, thank you very much, Minister Ian, for being here. We will suspend just for about 2 minutes, just so that we can get back on track. But thank you very much, Minister Ian. Suspension. With our rounds of questioning, we are going to come back. We'll be starting our second round, and we'll start with the CPC, and we'll have Dominique Vienne after her next bite. Okay, so for the or Michelle, we'll switch over to Michelle Ferrari for the beginning of our first panel. Michelle, you have the floor.
Bonjour. Enjoy your meal, Dominique. Okay, so thank you so much to everybody for being here and for answering our questions. I think one of the biggest concerns that is on the floor right now is just sort of efficient use of money. I think that is the number one concern when we have a cost of living crisis. So I'm hoping you guys could shed some light on supplementary estimates, be 2023 to 2024, the funds advocating gender equality. So there was just under $7 million allocated to this in grants and contributions, but $537,612 of that goes to department operating. My question is, why is this operating cost so high? That's almost 10% an operating budget. What is that money going to, and how is it an efficient use of money?
I was looking for the chair to answer the question, but perhaps I'll just start. I just want to make sure I know what you're looking at, which is the supplementary estimates for this year and the columns that you're looking at, which is operating expenditures, grants and contributions, and then statutory. Is that what you're looking at?
Yes, I believe so. So it's the $160 million is budgeted over 3 years, but then underneath the supplementary estimates, B 2023 to 2024, the funds advancing gender equality in particular.
Yes.
So it's just under $7 million. The exact number is $6,837,612. Yes. So then the operating costs are $537,612. So that's my question. That's just I just want to know what that money is.
Sure.
How is that broken down?
Sure. So generally speaking, when we do grants and contributions, it does take a fair bit of time for us to run a process, for example. So I will just mention one of our latest processes on the women's program, just closed on November 7th. We had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications, which was great, but it does take time to do the assessment and advice on which ones get funded. We always are oversubscribed. And so that really the operating money is really for our folks to be able to go through properly, do the assessments, and then manage the contribution agreement process.
So the $537,000 is strictly for you guys to decide who gets the money?
Well, it's for us to do the work of the proper assessment of the hundreds and hundreds of applications that we get to be able to determine the amount of money that we can provide and to whom, and provide that advice. And so, it's $500,000 or so dollars, which is, a few people to do the work.
How many is a few?
Well, generally speaking, I would say that the Treasury Board Secretariat tends to estimate, full-time equivalent folks at a certain level. We do have as well the employee benefits plan that has to be factored into that. So there's essentially a formula, depending on if it's a level of an officer, it might be an EC5. There's a specific range of salary, and we tend to go through.
What would that range of salary be? I mean, I guess what I'm having a hard time understanding here is you said hundreds of applications, and this is $537,000 to determine who gets money.
Well, let's think about the total value. I mean, the applications that we get represent, well over 500 million in terms of requests. And so for us to spend time properly assessing those, we really do want to make sure that we are giving everyone a fair shot. And so, we do take the time that we need to assess each application carefully.
So
then, as I said, the additional piece of it is the assessment, then the decision-making process, and then the establishment of the contribution agreements, which then requires monitoring and discussion with each with each recipient.
So are you saying it takes more money to decide if somebody gets a $500,000 contract, a $10,000 contract, or a $5 million contract? You're saying it's going to cost more money to assess that?
I'm saying it costs more money when you have a large volume of applications. And so each application has to be looked at separately and properly, and that takes the time that we have.
Who measures how long, or do you have key performance indicators of how long it should take you to assess an application?
About 15, 20 seconds.
The assessment of the applications, I would have to go back to our team to find out exactly how long it takes them. It depends on the call and what we've requested of each applicant. But I would say overall, when you have that level of volume and demand,
are you mandated on how
your
long
time
it
is
takes?
over. Thanks very much, Michelle. We're going to move on now to Mark Saray. Mark, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the work that you are doing. My first question has to do with the National Action Plan. But before I ask about the specific criteria, can you explain the narrative that we are hearing by the Conservatives saying that there have been cuts? Before the pandemic, there were funds allocated depending on the project, and during the pandemic, we had emergency funding that was doubled, and the provinces contributed as well. The Women's Association of my riding received additional funding, and the province assisted as well. And now we have a program on 10 years with permanent funding. And so there was funding for projects. There was additional funding during the pandemic, emergency funding, and now we have a plan over 10 years for funding, permanent funding. Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. For the action plan, it's true that the provinces and territories that are participating need to contribute to part of the action plan. It is an action plan on over 10 years, and currently we have 4 years of funding. That's why we are working closely with the provinces and territories to ensure that the funds that we spend are well spent and that we are able to show the results of that funding. And if there are adjustments to be made to the strategy or to funding, well, the different governments in Canada have the opportunity to do that. One of the pillars is men and boys. I've been on this committee for 5 years already, and there was a temporary program, but if I understood correctly, it is included in the discussions with provinces and territories. It's one of the main pillars. I believe that the minister mentioned that 25% of funds allocated. Can you explain where that funding is allocated for men and boys at elementary school and high school? Because you mentioned the importance of prevention and education to ensure that men are part of the discussion and part of the solution. Thank you for the question. It is a societal matter, and men and boys are part of the solution. I heard or I listen to witnesses that you've heard during other studies, and there is work to do on the trauma experienced by men and boys and how they can manage their emotions. This is indeed part of the prevention pillar. As the minister said, all of the provinces need to spend at least 20% of funding on prevention. We have many examples of how different jurisdictions have taken this on. Not everyone needs the same solution. For example, we work closely with Paktutik in the north, and they have programs with young Inuit men. And it's different in Nova Scotia, in a rural setting. And so we need to focus on the different needs of the different regions, and that's how the national plan will help.
25 seconds, okay.
25 seconds, all right. So I would like to thank you, but I would also like to come back to Madame Larouche's question from earlier. The work that you're doing with Francophone women throughout the country, they are not a part of the action plan, and I would like to ensure that you are able to focus on that and support Francophone women throughout the country. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
But as a statement, since we're way over time on that, so thank you so much. We're now going to move over to Adrienne Laroche. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had another question for you, but I'll start by following up on what Mr. Serre said, because the minister didn't fully answer my question, and I saw you nodding earlier. Currently, it is a lack of services for Francophone women throughout the country. They explained that for women who are victims of violence, for women who need health care or who need to be heard, they need to be heard in their language. In a crisis, one cannot be served in a language other than their maternal language, in this case French. What will you do to correct this situation? Answer: I am happy to give more information. We spoke with the association that you mentioned. We spoke with the provinces and territories because each province and each territory has a network of partners that they work with in order to develop and implement their plan. For example, the organization that you mentioned, they were very interested in the BC case, that they were not able to be a part of the province's consultation group, and we put them in touch. And I met with managers of the organization that you mentioned. And when we were in I mentioned this when we were in PEI. So the Alliance des Femmes Francophones du Canada. I met with them in pre-budget consultations. And when they looked at the action plan and the funding, they came to speak to me to be sure that things would be changed for the next budget and that there would be funding for Francophone women to help them. And will you change that and make those changes for the National Action Plan? Thank you very much. We are focusing on the implementation of the National Action Plan. We want all associations in the provinces and territories to be part of the discussions with the provinces and territories. For us, it's important for the provinces and territories to engage with those associations. We have other projects, and we can perhaps talk about this later. But we have projects with women's groups, minority women's groups, official languages, minority women's groups, and we have different examples of groups that we work with in New Brunswick, for example, and elsewhere. It's important for people who need services in their languages. Same thing for immigrant women. We worked with the provinces and territories so that they take these people into account in their action plans. My time is running out, and so currently there are no services for them. They were consulted, they made recommendations to you, but even though they did that, there's nothing for them. Unfortunately, I ran out of time with the minister because I am concerned by the demands by Treasury Board. The minister wasn't able to fully answer. We're talking about cuts. I'm trying to find the number that you mentioned. Perhaps you can come back to it. There were questions that were asked. We agree that there needs to be a better control of public funding, but there are needs for women. And there's so much work to be done at the departmental level. I would like to know where you are going to make cuts. You talked about millions of dollars. Perhaps you can come back to this. Perhaps you have examined where you'll be having those cuts. Because considering what's going on, we need to increase budgets, or at least not make cuts anyway. I am very concerned by the impact of these cuts, because we need to continue to help people going through difficult situations. Thank you for the question. At Women and Gender Equality, we have resources to play the role that was given to us. Our role is not to do everything when we're talking about equality for women and gender diverse people. We want to push others to act. There are resources and needs throughout the government, and we agree that we need to be careful with that 50% of the population.
Over to Benita. Benita, you have the floor for 6.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I wanted to revisit the funding cuts on emergency shelters. So the minister, I had asked the minister about the $150 million cut around the emergency pandemic funding, which is still, the gender-based violence is still an emergency. It's systemic, it's embedded, it's consistent, so that this funding is still desperately needed. So saying that the women's program will meet the ongoing needs of shelters, how much funding are we talking about to meet the need? And is this addressed in the supplementary estimates B?
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. So in terms of the work that we're doing with shelters, first of all, Women's Shelters Canada is a very strong partner of ours. We work with them very closely on a range of issues. I think a couple of things I would say. One, the minister talked about the Gender-Based Violence National Action Plan. And you know, the shelters are part of the conversations that provinces and territories are having. And we will see, as we are able to publish the action plans for each organization, each jurisdiction, we will be able to see where those funds are going. I would also mention the crisis hotlines agreements that we had. And this was also during the pandemic. So the demand for crisis hotlines having grown significantly. We did commit $30 million over 5 years to address that. And all agreements with all of the provinces and territories have been signed. The money's out there. And so we do see that there are lots of areas where we can support. Victim services are a key issue as a key part of the pillars for the Gender-Based Violence National Action Plan. And we look forward to being able to share all the provincial and territorial plans with folks.
So this is very concerning that there is then what I'm hearing is not a commitment in supplementary estimates or about meeting the need of shelters. So we have a $150 million cut from a $300 million promise. So my next question is, what about the other half then of this $300 million? Are we at risk, and are the women's shelters at risk of losing the additional $150 million promised to emergency shelters?
I'm going to ask if I can ask Alia to answer that question, because Alia was around when all of this work was being done.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. So the $300 million was specifically to fund shelters, sexual assault centers, and any organization that was supporting those who were fleeing any kind of gender-based violence during the pandemic. So that funding was very specific to that emergency situation. So I just want to clarify that WAGE did not have resources previous to that to provide any kind of funding to shelters specifically in terms of their operations. This was emergency pandemic specific so that they could keep their doors open, because we knew there was a rise in violence against women. We could see what was happening in other countries before the pandemic had come to Canada. And so this is what that funding was for specifically. So it's not necessarily a cut, but it was time limited funding. So the pivot that we're talking about now is moving towards a national action plan where we're working with each province and territory through the $500+ million that was announced in budget to put in place bilateral agreements where each province and territory can prioritize what their needs are with respect to ending gender-based violence over the 10-year national action plan. So we talked about things like prevention, requiring 25% of the funding to go for prevention, but we also have priorities within the national action plan for the funding, which includes stabilizing the sector. So this is where we're sort of moving towards some of that support, potentially coming through PTs. And like the Deputy Minister said, we plan to make those agreements, those bilateral agreements, and the plans public on our website. Thank you.
Follow-up question to that then. Can you share what were the parameters by province territory that those funds were allocated? What information was used to allocate them by province and territory, those funds?
The funds allocated to each province and territory are allocated based on our usual formula that we work with Intergovernmental Affairs over in the Privy Council office to establish.
Great. 1 minute left.
Great. Can you share those, please?
They will all be public. And as the agreements are being made public, you're seeing the numbers all come out. Right now, what the Minister talked about, we have about 82% of the total funds available already accounted for, and the rest will be accounted for shortly.
Thank you. Madam Chair, can I ask that that criteria get tabled to this committee?
Absolutely, yeah.
And not the post criteria, the pre-criteria as the money is allocated, as well as post, if that's all we have. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. We're now going to start on to our next round with 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 2.5, 2.5, and I'm going to pass it over to Dominique Vienne for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ms. McRae, I was asking questions about the cuts announced by Ms. Freeland, or rather the President of the Treasury Board, $15 million. You talked about cutting in travel and external consultant groups, correct? In the supplementary estimates B, there are cuts of $579 million, and that's for this year, this fiscal year, for travel and professional fees. And this is a cut that was imposed on all departments. And so all departments, travel and professional services, that's what has been asked of all departments? Yes. Do you know the details of that 580 and how it is split for the professional services and travel? We gave us a global amount, but the Department of Finance and the Treasury Board said this is what you're getting, this is what you have to cut. Is wage having to cut in other budgets that could have been given to external contractors? Do you have any room in the budget for external contractors? I just want to be sure that I'm understanding the question. Have we cut elsewhere? No, that's not what I'm asking. You've talked about almost $600,000 for cuts in travel and external fees. And once those cuts have been done, is there still money left after that for you to continue working with these contractors? That amount was for this year. Can you still work with these external contractors? Yes. Will you do it for the rest of the year? Our professional fees include organizations that offer services. The Pay Center, for example, that's part of the external fees. The Department of Justice, if we have legal needs. And so, yes, we do spend on professional services, but that can include associations outside of government. For example, if there's an event for the government, we need to hire a company for translation services, or so you don't use internal resources at that time. Yes. Ms. McRae, can you tell me how many people have been hired in the department since 2015? You don't have to be specific, but do you have an approximate number? We could send you this information. We have people who come and go, and so we'd have to see how many have left and how many have arrived. You're a deputy minister. You're used to dealing with numbers every day. It would have increased by how many? Since 2015... Well, firstly, we became a department in 2018, and I think that the growth happened mostly at that time. But in 2015, I think we were about 70 people, and now we are perhaps between 300 and 400 people. That's a lot of additional people. How can you justify going from 70 to almost 400? Answer: we were asked to do a lot of things. For example, the work on gender-based violence, and we have a new secretariat. Ms. McRae, do you... Inaudible.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass it over to Lisa. Lisa, you have the floor for 5.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Francis and Aliyah, for being here with us today. I just want to clarify off the top. So we have not actually seen cuts to funding for women's shelters. It was pandemic funding that was dispersed, and when that ended, we started a national action plan, which is now rolling out across the country. Can you clarify, sorry, on the record, instead of a nod?
That is correct.
Thank you. And further, my colleague Ms. Zarillo asked about the formula for funding through the National Action Plan. And I think there is a formula that you can share with the committee. I believe it's the provinces get a base funding of 2 million, territories get a base funding of 4 million, and then it's calculated based on population.
Yes, the formula is the formula that is typically used for transfer payments with the provinces and territories that is government-wide.
Thank you. I just thought that was helpful for the committee to clarify that there is a formula that people can look at. And next, I'd like you, we were talking earlier in the committee about GBA plus analysis. Would you just get to the basics of what this means, what it does, why it's important for departments to follow this process, and how we're doing in terms of compliance among departments?
Madam Chair, thank you very much for that question. GBA analysis is something that Canada has been doing for about 25, 30 years now. We have worked very hard with government departments, and our role as convener and capacity builder and knowledge broker, this is really where it comes in, because it really is everyone's job to do. Gender-based analysis, that I would use the words of the Auditor General, Ms. Hogan, who talks about when you ask her where's the key accountability, she says it belongs with every minister and every department, and that is fundamentally our approach. When we talk about what it really is just considering the various factors that we need to keep in mind as we're designing programs or policies to ensure that there are no barriers to access. And there are many people, and we've talked about it here at this committee, who do face additional barriers, and we don't want our government programs and services to be inaccessible to anyone. And so we have to take special measures to do that, and that's what departments and agencies are required to do. They're required to do it for memorandum to cabinet, for Treasury Board submissions, increasingly for budget proposals, and of course the Gender Budgeting Act does put a fair bit of pressure on organizations to come forward with that information. When we think about compliance, you asked about compliance, we have been playing a role as, again, a kind of aggregator of information. We have now taken our implementation survey that we send to organizations. We've revised it with information and input from the Auditor General and from various committees and stakeholders. And that implementation survey is now out in the field with our colleagues, and we expect to be able to publish it in the coming months once we have responses in.
Do you have any indication at this point then which departments are fulfilling that obligation and which maybe aren't as well?
We have a sense that all departments are taking this quite seriously, and I would say that one of the big pluses on our side is that we have very strong partners in this, which is Privy Council Office and the Treasury Board Secretariat. They are the gates through which people have to pass through when they are proposing policy and funding authority ideas, and they are they're really, I think, really improving their expectations of departments and agencies as they put forward proposals, and that's a really strong plus for us.
That's good to hear. Going back to the gender wage gap that we heard about, we know that federally we have legislation to ensure pay equity among genders. Does that legislation put any pressure, or does it have any effect on the private sector or other levels of government?
25 seconds to respond.
We do believe it does have an impact on others. Certainly, when we think about pay equity, some of the things we also have to look at are the structures of government and the structures of workplaces. It's not just about pay equity, it is about some of the other things that we talk about around the systems and structures that people are in. And I would say Minister Ian and Minister O'Regan did a really good video on Pay Equity Day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're now going to go into our 2.5-minute round. Adrienne, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we talk about the budget that was increased during the pandemic, I think some might think that everything has been solved. But for women who are victims of violence, there's an increase in needs. There has been an increase in needs. I know it's just a matter of wording, but it has an impact. The minister left, but she is also responsible for the Canada Summer Jobs program. And young people enjoy that program and they're getting experience. I know that this is one of the responsibilities of Minister Ian. There was a study at FEWO that was brought forward by my colleague, Ms. Chabot, on the Summer Jobs program. The budget is the same as last year, and that already was difficult to manage. Perhaps you'll be able to talk to her about it. Thank you for the question. For the Canada Summer Jobs program, yes, we are aware of the study that is ongoing. We have a lot of applications for the Summer Jobs program, and we will share this message with her. Do you think that you will increase the budget to take into account the needs of employers and young people who are seeking to get some experience? Are you still talking about the Summer Jobs program? I can answer the question. As officials, we will be implementing the programs with the funding given to us by Parliament. Applications have always been very high, as you mentioned. Thank you.
I'm going to go on to the next 2.5 minutes to Benita. Benita, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And as the critic for disability inclusion, I need to talk about women with disabilities. So the objective of the Women's Program is to achieve the full participation of women in economic, social, and democratic life of Canada through systemic change. And I know that Dawn, who sits on the National Advisory Committee to End Violence, has a stat that 58% of women with a disability live on less than $10,000 a year. So my question is, please describe how women with disabilities will be supported through this funding.
Thank you very much for the question. So when you say this funding, I just want to clarify which funding you're talking about. The women's program specifically. So thank you very much for that question. Absolutely, women with disabilities are at a significant disadvantage. And, you know, this is when we talked a little bit about diversity and inclusion and barriers. Women with disabilities certainly face some of the highest barriers that we see. And it's even greater if we talk about women with other intersectional considerations or in rural areas, as an example. I would say that the women's program investment that we have in supplementary estimates B is really part of the overall $160 million that was provided in Budget 2023 and voted by Parliament to be able to add to the women's program. So this is our recent call for proposals that I was talking about that closed on November 7th is about women's economic empowerment. And we do expect to be able to support particularly marginalized women, including women with disabilities, in that process.
Thank you so much. And I know that there's not a lot of research around women with disabilities. It's been very hard to find, even through the Library of Parliament. There's very little research, very little data. So how do we find those groups that are supporting women with disabilities, and how do we get some data on that?
So thank you very much for that question. You're right that there is not a lot of research. We actually work very closely with Dawn to be able to understand what they're seeing on the ground as well. I think, we all see the most recent statistics on women with disabilities and people with disabilities generally. There are 8 million people in Canada who say that they have a disability that limits their daily activity. And so I would say disability statistics generally are not that easy to find. And of course, we are seeing, young women, reporting great numbers as well. So we do partner with Statistics Canada with their work on disaggregated data.
Thanks very much, Ms. McRae. We're now going to move back to finish off this round. We have 5 minutes, Ms. Michelle Frey, 5 minutes, and then over to Sonia.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks again for being here. I guess I want to continue where we were leaving off because I had so many more questions. So we're talking about the operating budget because as I said, we have a cost of living crisis. So I think taxpayers watching are very mindful of ensuring that money is efficiently used. And so we have $63 million to grants and contributions for advancing gender equality. So just, 68 million, just under 7 million. And we were talking about the $537,000 for operating costs. And I'm curious, you said you have hundreds of applications, so that's why you have to have this high number. But what is the formula that is decided on how much each employee is paid to do what is the formula that is decided on salary? Because what I really want to point out here, my colleague, Ms. Vienne, brought this up. She asked you a question. She wanted to know how the number of employees has changed since 2015 when Prime Minister Trudeau took office. And you guys have went from 70 employees to 400. So that is a significant number. When we talk about bureaucracy, when we talk about a cost of living crisis, that's a significant amount of money in salaries. Can you explain the formula that is decided on how you come up with an operating budget that is almost 10% of advancing gender equality?
Thank you very much for the question around resources. And I do recall last time we were talking at committee, we did actually table with committee as a follow-up the change in our resources. We have hundreds of millions more dollars that were provided to us by Parliament to implement programs in the time frame that we're talking about. To do that, we need people. And those funds go out to communities. We used to have a grants and contributions budget of about $19 million, and now we're up into hundreds of millions of dollars. And so it does take people to manage that work. We're quite prepared to be able to table with you those resources. I would just say the formula is it's not one specific formula. It depends on the program, depends on how it's delivered. The women's program has been very much direct contributions with specific organizations, hundreds and hundreds of projects. And we take care of those projects. We want to make sure that they go well. We're in touch with people on the ground. It does take resources to do that.
Okay, sorry, just because I have limited time. So this is a little bit baffling, and I'm going to be honest, it's a little bit insulting for people to be watching because the stats, things have gotten worse, significantly worse. As I talked to the minister earlier, there's 79% increase in violence against women. And crime, chaos, and you're saying, well, we have hundreds of millions of more dollars, but everything is worse. So people are watching at home and they're saying they're spending almost $600,000 to pay people to hand out money. Where's the money going? And we've seen this. I don't want this to be. I know you're doing your job, and I get that, but as a member of parliament elected to elevate the people's voices, and we are in a cost of living crisis where inflation drives up the cost of living. The more you spend that is not spent efficiently, the more the cost of everything goes up. So we've created a rabbit hole. The more money we give you, the more you need, because it's not doing what is expected. So you've just told us you've gotten hundreds of millions of more dollars, and you need more people to decide where that goes. And yet we have a 79% increase in violence against women, and we are the status of women. If the economy is not working, nothing works. And we've heard from my NDP colleague, women's shelters are not getting the money they need.
Go ahead.
Just a point of clarification, actually. The wage was created
debate,
in 2015,
debate.
so there was no
Debate.
department
Excuse
before
me.
that.
Debate.
Okay.
Thank you, Michelle.
So I think the bureaucracy is what is so upsetting to people, because there just doesn't seem to be there. You're not giving a clear answer on where this money is going and how it's getting into the hands of the people who need it most. Even in this $25 million that's asked for, the food bank is able to do it in $106,000, and they're the ones administering this menstrual equity program for people who need it. And you're saying $537,000. I would love you to table this, to break it down so people can see it. Prove me wrong, I guess
Okay,
is what I'm asking.
Michelle, your time is over. So on her behalf, if you could table that information specifically on the menstrual equity and showing the cost, that'd be wonderful. Now moving it over to Sonia. Sonia, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to ask about seniors, specifically senior women. We know seniors were impacted by the pandemic, and it was important to continue supporting the work of organizations supporting them. Can you talk about what kind of the departments doing the ongoing efforts to help senior women?
Thank you very much for the question. Certainly, senior women we're seeing in a number of areas need support. Entrepreneurship is one, as an example, because we do see a lot more women wanting to continue to work and contribute to the economy as they move out of their perhaps permanent jobs. We can give you some examples of some of the work we do with senior women, but I would just say that it's also senior gender diverse people that we see challenges with in areas, for example, where they are not feeling comfortable in care homes. So we do see on gender-based violence as well specific challenges around older women. And financial abuse is one of those areas that we see quite significantly, not just with intimate partners, but certainly with family members.
Thank you. I just learned about an hour ago, Minister Sachs announced $500,000 to Queen's University to develop online training modules for educators on gender-based violence and prevention. Can you provide an update to this committee on the work of your department doing specifically on GBV prevention with the provinces and territories, and especially on Ontario specifically, on Ontario province?
Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. So the work that Minister Sachs is announcing is work that we do closely with Public Health Association, Public Health Agency of Canada and Health Canada. They are partners with us in a range of areas around public health related to gender-based violence. When we talk about the province of Ontario, I think the minister was mentioning that we had made the announcement with the government of Ontario about a week or so ago, or a few weeks ago, and they have now made some announcements themselves about where those funds are going that they have been allocated. We look forward to making sure that the publication of those action plans shows transparently where the funds are going. And the minister did talk about reporting back in and on impacts, which is something that's very important to all of us as stewards of public funds.
2 minutes. And I also want to, if you can talk about how, the pillars, you talked about the 5 pillars of, a plan of gender-based violence, to end the gender-based violence. I know my colleague, Mr. Sarari, talked about one pillar. And then can you talk about the other 4 pillars, how that sets a foundation for the provinces as a guide to implement the plan?
Thank you very much for just taking out our handy booklet on the pillars. And it's important to note that these pillars were developed with the provinces and territories. We did not develop these on our own. Pillar 1 is support for victims, survivors, and their families. And what we've provided the provinces and territories with is just examples of areas where they could act. And it's really important that they speak to their own communities about what's needed. The second pillar is prevention, and those are certainly population-specific issues. We talked about men and boys being one of them. Training and guidance for professionals is really critical in terms of trauma-informed approaches. Pillar 3 is a responsive justice system, and this is one where we work closely with our colleagues at Justice, but also they work with the provincial justice departments. It really is a full justice system that we need to be looking at. The fourth pillar is implementing Indigenous-led approaches, and this was something that was very important to all ministers around the table when we discussed it. We recognize that Indigenous people have to be leading their own solutions, and those solutions are actually quite different depending on what part of the country you're in. And depending on what your specific situation is, even among the rights holder groups, there are different approaches for different places. The fifth pillar is social infrastructure and the enabling environment. We talked a little bit about that earlier. And so those are the key areas that are the foundation. And we do look forward to publishing the action plans.
Perfect, and we really appreciate that. I do have a couple questions that just came from here, and we will be ending very early, but I'm just going to we've lost one of our members. I'm just going to ask a couple questions. And Ms. McRae, I know you and I have discussed this before when we look at the gender-based analysis, because we know how important gender-based analysis is in order to create equity. And that people, regardless of whether you're living in the north, the south, east, or west of this country, whether you're Black or racialized or Indigenous or white, whatever you may be, gender-based analysis is really, really important. According to the Auditor General's report, only 40% of the budget actually had a gender-based analysis applied to it. I do not believe it is any of the intentions of this committee, or not committee, but of this department, because I do know the tools and resources are there. But we have departments that are not implementing the GBA Plus on their actual budgetary items. Can you just comment on that, please?
Point of order, Madam Chair. Shouldn't we be having the block or the NPD for the last 2 minutes?
No. The round? No.
Yeah.
No. The round is, for the round, it goes 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 2.5, 2.5, 5, 5. And the first round, it's 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. So we have already finished the full rounds, and so I am just taking the priority of that and being able to ask a question that Ms. McRae and I have actually discussed. Are you asking that I don't get the response? I'm sorry. Okay. Francis, can I get the response, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for the question. I would say that with the Gender Budgeting Act, which was only enforced since 2019, there has been significant change in terms of the department's GBA requirements in their proposals. I would say, though, Women and Gender Equality Canada does not participate directly in the budget process. We do work with our colleagues at the Department of Finance, whose, in fact, their capabilities and their competencies and the rigor that they are expecting is increasing. So I think we will expect to see a higher threshold that is enforced more by the central agencies than by ourselves, but we are certainly hearing that.
I really appreciate that. Bonita, Bonita, you had a question?
Can we send a letter from this committee that says that we would like to see more take-up on the GBA on all departments for budgets?
That is something that can absolutely be discussed. I think that's something that I was going to just ask for some documents, and let's see what we can do there, Bonita, for sure. Bonita, you had a request for documents right in the middle. Do you remember what that was? Can you remind them what it was? Internal.
Yes, it was about the formulas for the distribution by province and territory.
Thank you. And I think it was the pre and the post is what you were asking for. That'd be wonderful. One other thing is if you could provide the gender-based analysis that you provide to other departments, just so that we make sure, like my greatest concern is I know you're not trying to make it a checkbox. I know that it needs to be much deeper. So when these departments are looking at that, can we just see what they're being advised, that types of tools, if you could table that as well. Any further questions or comments from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much to Francis and to Aaliyah. Thank you so much for being here to support our committee. Today's meeting is adjourned. See you Monday.